So much, Rachel. Before we get into this conversation, we will first have a first response by Professor Jeremy Brown, who has been the ritual sung his praises already very rightly, I believe, and I only can add to that that he also has a new book out recently, which was so people are even writing faster than it's possible to catch up in the program. The program is obsolete already. Which is entitled The 11th Plague, Use and Pandemics from the Bible to COVID-19. I mentioned this because tomorrow, I believe, you'll be going to give a talk about this particular new book. So those who are interested can definitely attend to that occasion as well. The floor is yours now.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. I'm very grateful to Rachel for her really careful examination and re-examination of some of the sources that I analyze in my study, the Jewish reception of Copernican thought. And I had written, as Rachel pointed out, that the story of that Jewish reception of Copernican thought was non-linear. And it is this non-linear path that Professor Brooks traced in his third chapter of his book. And Rachel's analysis of the 5 rabbis that were included in my investigation concludes that Jews did indeed show some openness to the new scientific ideas, despite the fact that they had not gone the same kind of religious reformation found in Christian Europe. And I would like now to take a closer look at what I learned from my work and its relationship to this rich discussion that we're going to have on rigor and reproducibility in the humanities. I would like to point out that actually I think about replication every day of my working career and probably all day long. I work at the National Institutes of Health, which is the government body in the United States that gives out about $40 billion a year in grant funding to improve the health of people. And I'm involved in clinical trials, and these are very expensive undertakings. And you have to really think about designing a clinical trial that is going to be definitive, that somebody won't come back in a few years' time and say, oh, yes, but you didn't remember this or you didn't remember that, because it's very hard to replicate a clinical trial with 7,000 participants and it costs $15 million to perform. It's kind of hard to go back and say, can we have another 15 because we're really not quite sure and we'll need another 7 years to figure this out. So I do think about replication all day long, but certainly not in the same way that we're doing it in this really terrific venue. So in my book-long study, I discovered the complicated ways in which Jews took in their evaluation of Copernican astronomy. And these various paths led me to propose a hypothesis about the way in which communities of faith encounter a world based on scientific explanations. Before I get to that hypothesis, I want to describe 2 aspects of the heliocentric theory, the Copernican theory, that make it uniquely valuable as an aid to discovering how faith communities respond to challenging scientific facts. So first, for many religious thinkers, the heliocentric theory is or was diametrically opposed to the literal meaning of the Bible. And there can be no starker contrast, really, between a scientific and religious concept of the universe than this. In various places in the Bible, it quite literally states that the sun moves and the earth is stationary. Joshua commanded the sun to stand still at Gibeon. Isaiah prophesied that the sun's shadow would move back as a sign of forgiveness for King Hezekiah. And the book of Ecclesiastes opens with a powerful declaration of the earth's immutability. So it really is a clash of the 2 cultures. And second, and this is super important, second, for over 300 years, Copernicus's heliocentric theory was a theoretical construct only. It had no experimental support. And in this way, it differed from other theories we encounter today, such as the theory of evolution or the theory of relativity, which have behind them a great deal of experimental support. So the Copernican model explained the motions of the planets in a far more satisfactory way than did the previous Ptolemaic model, but for almost 300 years, and this is really important, as I said, it was an unproven hypothesis and not a scientific theory. Not too long after Copernicus published his work, it was clear to some that experimental evidence would indeed be needed to brought to bear on the question. For example, in 1674, the scientist Robert Hooke wrote that if a certain proof called stellar parallax could be detected, it would, quote, be a most undeniable argument of the truth of the Copernican system. So everybody knew we needed to get some evidence for this. It remains hypothetical until then. And the important point here is that until there was that scientific evidence, this remained theoretical, and that didn't come until the 19th century. So for 3 centuries, both Jewish and Christian thinkers faced a challenge from a scientific hypothesis, not evidence, but a hypothesis that essentially had no experimental support. And now, although I claim in my book that the Jewish reception of Copernican thought are non-linear, when we look back at the historical evidence, there is little doubt that taken as a whole, Judaism in its many contemporary forms has today made its peace with what was once a most troubling of theories. Judaism's gradual acceptance of the heliocentric theory suggests that although scientific models and accounts of the natural world may first be viewed with hostility, they may eventually be accepted and even welcome in a faith community. As we look at what happens with the Copernicus, some chose to accept the model all at once, and Rachel has pointed out some of those people, given the authority of the scientists who supported it, while others rejected it because of a lack of experimental evidence and because the Bible says it ain't so. When experimental evidence did become available, the biblical objections were reconsidered. And while those who are held onto the geocentric model maintained that the evidence was faulty or incorrectly interpreted. This is a key response that I found in faith communities. The evidence from the scientists is suspect because we know better than the scientists and they forgot to do this or that. But eventually, even this objection is unlikely, and even the most conservative movements within Judaism, certainly today, have made their peace with the heliocentric model of Copernicus. Now, if this is a representative pattern, this sort of non-linearity, this early rejection and early pointing out that the science isn't correct, but an eventual receptivity, if this pattern is representative, then we're going to see it again when Judaism is again faced with other challenges that are based on scientific beliefs. And in fact, even though it's been around for a far shorter time than the heliocentric theory, a strikingly similar pattern can already be seen in the Jewish reception of Darwin's theory of evolution. A full evaluation of the Jewish reaction to Darwinian evolution is in itself worthy of a book-length analysis, and I know Rachel has pretty much been undertaking that, but we can make a few general points. First, very early on in its history, the theory of evolution had people who had Jews, rabbinic, who were in favor of it. In what was likely the first American Jewish response to Darwin, from Joseph Krauskopf, who died in 1923. He was a Reform rabbi who graduated from the first class of the Hebrew Union College, and he proclaimed that Darwinism, though disagreeing with the biblical account of creation, is within religion, not against it. The Orthodox chief rabbi and first chief rabbi in mandatory Palestine accepted the theory when he wrote that it coincides with the lofty doctrines of Kabbalah more than any other philosophical teaching. But however, these positions didn't find much traction within the Jewish community. And first, as it was understood at the time, there wasn't much scientific evidence to support the theory of evolution. And secondly, perhaps more importantly, the theory implied a diminished role for a divine creator. But over time, this approach has become more nuanced, and increasingly a number of Orthodox Jews have written to support evolutionary theory within a Jewish worldview. And this culminated with Great Britain's late Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who acknowledged that evolution has, quote, immense religious implications, and concluded the story he told by saying, Darwinian biology is wondrous almost beyond belief. It remains the most beautiful story ever told. How it happened, we will never know for sure, but it suggests a story of almost infinite divine patience, consistent with everything we know from the Bible, yet on a scale only mystics hitherto imagined. That's quite an incredible statement from an Orthodox rabbi about a theory that is seen to be so challenging to the belief in a divine creator. Now, so based on my detailed examination of the Jewish reception of Copernican thought and supported by this preliminary observation that the Jewish reception of Darwinian evolution is following the same path, I made what I consider to be a testable prediction, a scientific statement about the way that Jews and perhaps all Western religions respond to a new scientific explanation. And the hypothesis is this: although these explanations are first ignored, then may be viewed with initial hostility, they will eventually be accepted and even welcomed. When experimental evidence becomes available, biblical objections are reconsidered and the biblical texts are reinterpreted. Those who still cling to the prior religious worldview now claim that the evidence was faulty or incorrectly interpreted, but inevitably this objection is overcome, and even the most conservative religious thought leaders make their peace with the new explanations. So that's my hypothesis about what's going to happen down the road to the next big confrontation between science and history. It'll be ignored, then people will say the scientists don't know what they're talking about, and then they'll start to accept the theory, and then they'll reinterpret all the texts that came before them to show that it was always there all along. And I want to turn to an example of what I think that test case is going to be, and then I'm going to end with some remarks about falsification in the humanities. And this is the question of the religious challenges from neurodeterminism. Over the last 50 years, advances in neuroscience have raised deep and weighty questions about what it means to think and to act with free will. And we've come to understand that our minds are more determined than we had ever imagined. Take, for example, depression. We now have at least a preliminary understanding of its biochemical basis, and as a result, it is possible to successfully treat the disease with medication. Furthermore, the genetic basis of a vast number of other disorders, once classified under the general and imprecise umbrella of mental disorders, has been determined. It would seem that the way we feel or interact with others is not volitional, but is in at least some part, or maybe a large part, predetermined by the genes that we inherit. This genetic basis of our behavior may even affect our ability to make moral decisions. There is evidence that criminal behavior may not only be the result of personal choice, but may also be genetically programmed from conception. All this evidence suggests that people cannot act otherwise than they do. Now, for this, it raises a huge religious question, whichever religion you happen to be in, because it raises problems to do with choice and sin and repentance. What role do Yom Kippur and Lent play in seeking God's forgiveness if we were never had any free choice in the matter? We were never able to do otherwise than we did. What becomes of the conception of reward in the afterlife if our actions here on earth are never freely made? It's questions like these that are the basis, I think, of a new interest in the way in which scientific theories affect religious sensibilities. Now, although neurodeterminism has increasingly challenged the religious concepts of free will and hence concepts of rewards and punishment, the collected evidence, the evidence of neurodeterminism, that our actions are often determined, although it's persuasive, you really can't say this has been experimentally verified. And so the notions of determinism stand in a similar relationship to religious thought as the Copernican model did almost 500 years ago. The evidence for both is convincing, but not absolute. The implications that each has for traditional religious concepts are far-reaching. And so the techniques that religious communities use and continue to use to deal with the challenge of Copernican thought are therefore likely to be able to teach us much about the way in which these same faith communities can face similar theoretical challenges from contemporary scientific community. Now, if my analysis of how Judaism reacted to Copernicanism is correct, we can make the following simple prediction, which in the full spirit of the scientific method may be falsified. And I'm going to return to falsification in a moment. Although initially there will be some Jews who will see no problem reconciling a biochemical basis of human behavior with traditional Jewish teachings on free will and personal responsibility, at first, most Jewish thinkers will overwhelmingly write against it. They will maintain that the theory stands in opposition to a number of biblical verses and will further claim that in any event, the theory is scientifically flawed for reasons that are clear to them, but somehow opaque to those scientists actually involved in the research. After a number of years, and perhaps several decades, and assuming that more scientific evidence accumulates to support the theory, the tide will slowly turn in favor of religious accommodation. Eventually, the overwhelming majority of Jews, or at least those for whom such things matter, the overwhelming majority of Jews will accept that there is no conflict between the biochemical explanations of human behavior and Jewish thought, and will claim that traditional sources, when properly understood, can be interpreted in a way that lends support to their inclusive approach. So that's my hypothesis, and I do hope that it will be tested, although I doubt I will be around to see its vindication or refutation. But finally, I want to return now to the whole question of rigor and reproduction and falsifiability in the humanities.
Couple of minutes.
Yeah. Within the humanities in general and history in particular, what is the relationship between a falsifiable scientific theory and rigor and reducibility? So to answer this, we must decide what it is that reproducibility in history is attempting to do, and ask three questions. And Rachel alluded to this in her presentation. Does history, number one, uncover data? Does it, number two, tell a story? Or does it, number three, explain why something happened the way it did? So to give a concrete example, are we, in terms of number one, are we uncovering data? Did Judaism accept the Copernican model? What, yes or no? And this is almost binary with yes/no complications. And it sort of reflects the question that we asked earlier. How many Puritans were there in the Royal Society? You can count them up and see. So that's the uncovering data aspect. Are we perhaps telling a story? What was the Jewish reaction to Copernican thought? How did those facts, those data points interact with each other? This too is history, but unlike relying on hard data, it uses sources that are available or considered important. And here the choices become subjective. And finally, is history explaining what went on? Why did the various Jewish thinkers and rabbis either reject or accept the Copernican thought? So it's different to the story. Story tells us what happens. The answer, this tells us, explains what happened. I think that the work of history can be all three, but we really have to make sure we're figuring out what it is, what kind of history, and perhaps there are more subtypes that we're attempting to reproduce before we attempt to do so with rigor and falsifiability. Finally, I've mentioned falsification, and I want to end with this. Since Karl Popper, most of us believe that a scientific statement is one that at its basis is subject to falsification. It only takes one black swan to disprove the thesis, which in this case is nothing more than an observation that all swans are white. The idea of falsifiability is to empirically test a theory or hypothesis to see if it is false, and replication is the accepted way of determining this. But we do have to remember that not all hypotheses or observations are scientific, in so much as they can be falsified. But this does not make them less important. E equals mc squared is a scientific explanation. Proclaiming that I love you is not, but we need both, because both enrich our lives. What then, I would ask, are we to do with the non-falsifiable theories in the humanities, discard them as unscientific, or embrace them because they too enrich our lives? I look forward to hearing the rest of the fascinating discussion